long before the ring was forged, long before the kingdoms of men rose and fell, there was an island that touched the edge of heaven, a gift from the Valar, a promise of peace. Its name was Númenor. After the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was cast into the void, the Valar looked upon the men who had fought beside the Elves, the Edain, and they took pity on them. The world had been broken by war, and so they raised from the sea a land untouched by shadow. They said, "Here you may live long and free of fear. Here you shall see the light of Aman across the waves, but you shall not set foot upon its shores." And so the Edain came westward. They built cities of white stone and towers that gleamed in the morning sun. They learned from the Eldar, spoke with the Valar's messengers, and for a time, a long golden age, they were content. The sea was their road, not their cage. They sailed east to teach, not to conquer. Their ships were temples of light that crossed the oceans like stars upon the water. Men of wisdom, men of peace, men who had forgotten the word war. But paradise does not silence the heart for long. It only gives the heart time to whisper. The people of Númenor looked to the west and saw a land they could never reach. Aman, the undying lands, where elves lived forever. And slowly, envy began to stir. They saw their own fathers grow old and die, while the Eldar remained unchanged. They began to ask questions no mortal should. Why must we die if we have served the Valar faithfully? Why do the immortals keep eternity only for themselves? And in those questions, the first shadow entered Númenor. Still, the island thrived. The capital, Armanielos, rose higher each century, its walls white as pearl, its domes gilded in the light of the two trees, remembered only in song. From its harbor, thousands of ships set sail, bringing gifts to Middle-earth, lore, craft, healing. They built monuments to Eru Ilúvatar, and at the mountain's peak, the Meneltarma, they held silent worship facing west. There, no unclean word was spoken, only the wind, only the waves, only gratitude. But gratitude is fragile. The longer it lives, the easier it cracks. Generation after generation, the Númenorians grew stronger, and their hearts turned from reverence to pride. They looked eastward and saw lesser men still living in darkness, and they began to rule them, not teach them. The Sea Kings were born, kings whose crowns glittered like the sun, but whose eyes had already begun to darken. The gifts of the Valar became rights. The rights became expectations, and expectation became hunger. They were still noble, still wise, but beneath that brilliance lay a seed that would one day tear the island from the sea. For now, though, Númenor shone brighter than any realm in Arda. From its highest towers, one could see the faint shimmer of the undying lands across the western horizon. Close enough to see, but never close enough to reach. And that is how the tragedy of Númenor began, not with war or wrath, but with longing. For centuries, Númenor stood unchallenged. Its ships ruled the seas. Its people walked taller than any in Middle-earth, and the Valar watched in silence as gratitude turned to pride, and pride turned to fear. Because even kings fear one thing they cannot command: death. The Elves had eternity. The Valar had eternity. Only men were denied it. And in that denial they began to believe they had been deceived. The early kings were wise. They accepted their fate, speaking of death as a gift, not a curse. But with each generation their hearts grew colder to the west. The sacred mountain, Meneltarma, where once they prayed in silence, became empty. The people no longer climbed its slopes. They built temples instead, temples to kings, to power, to themselves. The sea no longer carried their mercy. It carried their armies. They sailed east not to teach, but to rule. Cities of lesser men were burned, their leaders forced to kneel before the banner of the star. The Númenóreans called it dominion. The world called it conquest. And in that age of arrogance, a shadow rose from the east. Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, the deceiver, who had survived the ruin of Angband, watched the growing empire of men with quiet fascination. He saw in them a reflection of his master's pride. He saw ambition, and he knew how to shape it. When the king of Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, landed in Middle-earth with an army so vast that the ground trembled under its weight, Sauron did not fight. He laughed, and then he knelt. Before the throne of Ar-Pharazôn, the Dark Lord of the Middle-earth bowed his head. Chains were placed upon his hands, but his eyes were free. The Númenóreans brought him back across the sea, a trophy of their triumph. A prisoner paraded through Armanelos. The people rejoiced. "The darkness has been defeated," they cried. But in truth, the darkness had only changed its shape. In the golden halls of the king, Sauron waited. He spoke softly, humbly, as one who sought forgiveness. He offered counsel. He spoke of death, of the cruelty of the Valar, of immortality stolen from men. His words were honey, wrapped around poison. Ar-Pharazôn listened. He had always feared the day his body would fail him. And Sauron whispered, "You need not fail. You need only to take what was denied. Year by year, stone by stone, Sauron rebuilt his power, not through armies, but through faith. He built a new temple, vast as a mountain, its peak piercing the clouds, and at its heart, an altar of fire, dedicated not to Ilúvatar, but to Melkor, the first Dark Lord, the god of rebellion, the giver of freedom. The smoke of sacrifice rose above Armanelos. The sea grew still, and the light of Númenor dimmed. The faithful, those few who still remembered the old ways, hid their prayers in secret. Among them were Amandil and his son Elendil, the last line of those who still looked west. They watched as their people turned to madness and prayed that the Valar would show mercy once more. But mercy cannot protect those who choose their own ruin. And so it was that under Sauron's shadow, the greatest of men became the slaves of fear. Their hearts grew darker than the sea that had once carried their glory. And at last, the Golden King made his final vow. He would not die immortal. He would storm the gates of heaven itself. The sky above Númenor darkened. Winds howled across the golden domes of Armanelos. The air smelled of storm and salt and doom. At the king's command, the fleet was ready. Hundreds of ships, their hulls plated with gold, their sails black as night. From every harbor they poured into the western sea, a storm made of men. Their prows were carved like dragons, their masts taller than the towers of the world. And at their head stood Ar-Pharazôn, the Golden, the pride of men, the last king of Númenor. He looked westward toward the light of Aman, and in his heart he said, "Why should death rule over me? Why should the Valar keep eternity for themselves?" Behind him, Sauron smiled. His chains were long gone. He walked freely through the temples he had built, watching the smoke of sacrifice climb higher than the mountain. He knew what would come. He wanted it. The fleet sailed beyond the Ban of the Valar into forbidden waters where no mortal had ever gone. The waves grew still The world held its breath. From the shores of Aman, the Eldar watched in silence, and at the feet of Manwë, the Valar knelt. They did not speak. They did not strike. They turned their faces to the One, and Eru Ilúvatar answered. The sea rose, not with thunder, but with judgment. The sky split open. Lightning crowned the horizon. The wind became a scream. The waves towered higher than mountains, crashing down upon the armada. Ships shattered like glass. Men cried out to gods who would no longer listen. The golden prows burned in white fire, and the sea swallowed them whole. From the heart of the island, the earth split. The temple of Melkor collapsed inward, its flames pouring into the abyss. Ar-Menellos fell. The Meneltarma broke in two. Númenor was no more. It sank beneath the waves in a single night. The greatest kingdom of men, the most beautiful land ever given to mortals, gone like a dream at dawn. And what of Sauron? His body was destroyed, burned to nothing in the fires he had kindled. But his spirit, dark and unbroken, rose from the deep and fled back to Middle-earth, a shadow without shape. He had lost his fair form forever, but his will endured. The lesson was learned. The world had changed, and the shadow would rise again. Not all were lost. In the midst of the storm, a few ships remained. The faithful, the elf friends, guided by Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion. Their vessels were small, their faith unbroken. They carried the white tree, the seed of hope, and the memory of light. The sea spared them. And when the sun rose again, they saw the shores of Middle-earth before them. There, they built new kingdoms, Arnor in the north, Gondor in the south, and from their lineage would come the last hope of men. The world was no longer flat. The straight road was hidden, curving beyond mortal reach. Only the elves could still find the way to the west, and the ocean kept its secret. Deep beneath the waves, the ruins of Númenor still sleep, its bells silent, its towers broken, its people forgotten by time. But sometimes when the storm rises, sailors swear they hear a song beneath the wind, a lament in a tongue no one remembers, the song of a kingdom that reached for heaven and found the sea. Every wave that touches Middle-earth still carries its echo, a warning, a memory. Tell me, do you know any other kingdom in Tolkien's world that fell so completely? Or do you believe there was one even greater than Númenor? Write it in the comments below. Because every rise in Middle-earth carries the shadow of its fall.